Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Martin. I'm with the Church and Society Committee at Whitefish Bay United Methodist Church. I want to welcome you all to tonight's panel on environmental racism, particularly with just such a beautiful evening out and willing to take your time to spend time with us. Before I introduce our topic and the speakers, just some logistics. Please make sure your devices are on mute. We will be monitoring the chat feature throughout the session, and we will respond to questions as they come up and when it is appropriate. Having said that, we still would like to keep this relatively informal. If you want to verbally ask a question, please use the function to raise your hand virtually, and we will call on you again when it makes sense to do so. Please note that we are recording this session and it will be available on our website. In addition, already we've got an attachment in the chat feature that has a list of resources that Dr. Sen has provided to us, and that information, you can pull it off the chat. We will also have it available on the church's website. I think it's actually available on the church's website now. So this panel is sponsored by, again, the Church and Society Committee of the United Methodist Church of Whitefish Bay. Our committee's mission is to promote systemic change in order to achieve peace and justice in our world, as we're called to do so by Jesus Christ. So recently, the church completed an 8-part racial diversity series, and that series discussed the history and societal impact of racism in America. Our session tonight is a bookend to that series and will focus on environmental justice here in Milwaukee. We are very fortunate to have a great lineup of panelists tonight who will share their experiences here in Milwaukee, which they've done through the Buildings, Landscape, and Cultures Field School within the School of Architecture and Urban Planning at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Our lead panelist is Dr. Arijit Sen, who's an Associate Professor of Architecture and Urban Studies at UWM. He's an architect and vernacular architecture historian and directs the Buildings, Landscape, and Cultures Field School. He focuses on urban culture landscapes. His research explores immigrant histories, post-disaster reconstruction, and communication-based design. He's the author and editor of multiple articles and book chapters. Particularly want to thank him for taking the time to coordinate this with his other participants are some past students of his, and thank him for coordinating to make this presentation happen. Also with us tonight, Tatum Markey. She's a public historian and museum professional. She holds a Master of Arts in Public History with a graduate certificate in museum studies from UWM. While pursuing her graduate degree, she coordinated and edited a series called Taking Back Our World, which is an environmental justice exhibition and storytelling project at the Milwaukee Environmental Justice Lab. She has been a Fellow of Humanities with a Humanities Action Lab at Rutgers University. Mallory Zinke is a public historian with the National Park Service, River Trails and Conservation Assistance Program. She recently finished her Master's of Arts in Public History with certifications in Museum Studies and Nonprofit Management at UWM. She has also served as a fellow with the Humanities Action Lab out of Rutgers and led research development for Taking Back Our Worlds. And then our fourth panelist is Chelsea Waite, who coordinates research projects at the intersection of community engagement, creative arts, cultural landscapes, and public history. She's a doctoral candidate in architecture whose dissertation, Landscapes of Caring, analyzes the care practices of Milwaukee residents using ethnographic observation and archival research. She has presented her research at national conferences, presented guest lectures, and teaches at UWM. She's also a co-author of some articles that have been peer-reviewed, focused on building landscapes and cultures field school and architectural pedagogy. Again, as I mentioned before I turn over the presentation, I would like to point out that Dr. Sen has provided us with a list of resources, which we will be posting on the church's website, and we will also be posting, we are recording this again, and this will be posted on the church website. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sen for his presentation and the other panelists.
Hi, everyone. I'll be introducing it, and Arijit is bringing up the slides right now. My name is Chelsea Waite. As Mike so graciously said, and thank you for those thorough introductions, and thank you all for hosting us tonight. We're excited to have this conversation with you. So as Mike said, I'm a doctoral student, a doctoral candidate at the School of Architecture and Urban Planning in Milwaukee. I've been working with Dr. Sen for a number of years, and I'm here to explain exactly how all of these different labels and projects come together. And so I'll begin with the next slide. First, however, I would like to acknowledge that we are joining you today, and if you're in Milwaukee or the Milwaukee area, we are on land that is shared by many indigenous nations, the Oceti Sakowin, otherwise known as Sioux, Wazicha, Miamia, Menominee, Bodowadmiakiwen, Peoria, and Kickapoo. These people have a past, present, and future here, despite a long history of settler colonialism and military campaigns that are ongoing today. Secondly, about this acknowledgement, I believe that acknowledging the land is important, but it is not land back, and it only grazes the surface of a long struggle. The map that I've included here on the side, or the screenshot of a map, outlines tribal nations, but it also defies our conventional understandings of what a map is, because there are overlaps, transparencies, and we can only find our location if we trace along the edges of water bodies. So I bring this also as a resource, nativeland.ca, and I'll put a link in the chat later, because you can also peruse not only tribal nations, but also territories, treaties, and languages, and you can also find some helpful links to understand more about the local nations here. With that, I would like to transition to the subject of environmental justice. Certainly that is deeply connected to the legacy of stewardship by Indigenous people of the lands and waters here. So to begin with, buildings, landscapes, cultures, which will be occasionally referred to as BLC, was formed in 2008 as an interdisciplinary research program linking researchers and students from Madison and Milwaukee in the fields of architecture, history, urban studies, geography, theory, and so on. BLC focuses on studying the quote-unquote ordinary world so that we can more deeply understand power, resistance, and justice in the places that matter to us. From this doctoral program, BLC has branched into a series of community engaged projects involving students of all levels, as well as neighborhood organizations, community leaders, and Milwaukee residents. So one of the main projects under BLC is the Field School, the Buildings, Landscapes, Cultures Field School. A field school is a hands-on learning tradition in the life sciences in which students do mentored field research, often during the summer. The field refers to the lived reality of research subjects. Often research in this vein was developed on ideas of racial hierarchy about quote-unquote civilization, often with Western or white researchers studying Indigenous people of color and unequal power relationships. So the BLC Field School challenges that traditional format in order to be more ethical, respectful, and collaborative. We wanted our research to be meaningful to the people and meaningful and useful to the people and places we research, rather than getting our data that we need and leaving to write our books and articles and so on. So what were our innovations? We shifted the focus of our field school from rural vernacular architecture to urban spaces and current issues so that we could really examine the subject of race, place, and stewardship. We took up new methods in history to engage the public, such as storytelling events, podcasts, mini documentaries, and virtual webinars, to name a few. We saw ourselves as helping to tell the stories of place that matter and the people who are stewards of those places. Most importantly, we built long-term relationships with community partners. So as it stands now, the Field School is both a learning experience, but also we refer to it as an archive of the interview recordings, drawings, photographs, and other documents that are the stories of over 200 participants, community members, the 80 or so student researchers and sometimes community researchers, and also the work of about roughly 40 architecture students, design work. With that, we can move to the next slide. So with that, you might be wondering how the environmental justice lab fits into this, the MKE-EJ lab, which is the main focus of what we're speaking about here tonight. I've got this kind of rough timeline to explain exactly the kind of nature of these relationships. As you can see, it starts on the bottom left-hand corner with buildings, landscapes, cultures. Along the bottom row, you can see kind of a timeline of the field schools that we've had. And these often, like I mentioned before, take place during the summer. You'll also notice how they became longer as we developed multi-year relationships with the places and the people that we worked with. And often they're paralleled in a series of courses that go on during the fall and summer, whether they are graduate seminars or studio design courses. You can also see how the EJ lab kind of rises out of this as something that becomes kind of an umbrella project, feeding from the field school and so on. So let's move on to the next slide. And I'll just reiterate that our main goal is to listen deeply to the stories of people in their own words, and then to amplify and disseminate those stories publicly and preserve them as local history that matters to the people with whom we're working. So as we have been listening over the last several years, we began to understand that a lot of injustice begins with the idea that nothing is here or nothing is in the Washington Park and Sherman Park areas, or that it's empty, or that no one cares. People in Sherman and Washington Park are often forgotten, ignored, or silenced by ideas that they don't care what happens in their neighborhood. When discussing so for example, when discussing the location of an ecologically harmful or unpleasant industry, such as the proposal of a recent slaughterhouse, there's an idea that somehow it's justified because it will improve the conditions that are there. And these are the problematic stereotypes that you might hear in conversations on the news and so on, in sometimes subtle or subconscious ways. So these conditions, of course, the conditions of poverty or kind of what is seen as emptiness, are created through a history of racist redlining, destructive freeway clearance, the departure of jobs, and more recently, the foreclosure and eviction crises, which of course are a more unconventional form of environmental justice. But I want to move back to our work. The simple act of listening affirms that people live here and that they care about their neighborhoods. And that's why we listen to community leaders like Camille Mays and Sherry Fuqua, and many others who work hard to uplift their communities against these injustices that play out at the urban scale. They dedicate their lives to bringing their communities much deserved beauty, hope, and healing. So after listening, we began to think about themes that tie together these interviews, the subjects and so on that are contained in those personal histories, and what's playing out in the neighborhood. And environmental justice was an incredibly powerful theme that ties together both the struggles that people are going through, but also what we're seeing around us. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Sen. Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. I also wanted to thank Sue and Walt, Janet, Michael, Vernetta, and everyone else who planned this panel. And I just want to actually sincerely thank my fellow panelists, Tatum, Chelsea, Mallory, whose collaboration has really advanced the works and thoughts of our field school project. I also want to begin by acknowledging the incredible lessons and wisdom that we learned from our community partners, from the land and the stewards of this land, as we examine the issue of environmental and climate justice in Milwaukee. But that I will not speak for them. Interspersed in this presentation, you will hear their voices directly from them. Building trust in itself is a form of engaged justice work, and I urge all of you to approach our neighborhood partners on your own, work with them, build trust, and make the world a more just place for all of us. So I'm going to start with a little clip of the partners telling us some of the main things that we're going to expand on.
One of the things that I advocate for is connecting the dots between one issue and another issue. They're all interrelated somehow, right? So when we talk about all of these issues that both communities have, if you pay close enough attention, you can find the common threads that connect all of these issues together.
You definitely want to, connect all of the injustices that are happening in a neighborhood, right? There's housing injustices, there's, the environmental situations, there's a social justice, with the police. Speaking of like the incinerator down the street, there were several back in the 80s that were proposed all around New Jersey, but the only two that received those incinerators was Camden and North, which are the two biggest, heavily, populated communities with people of color, poor people of color.
Honestly, just looking at what's happened to Milwaukee and working on this project and what's been going on, I see us in our neighborhood, our community, especially like along the corridors, as disposable. I've always seen us as disposable in our neighborhood.
Yeah, so Milwaukee is, as Camille said, Blacks in the state of Wisconsin only account for 6.3% of the population in the entire state. And so Milwaukee is kind of seen as a place that people outside of Milwaukee don't care about.
And I often tell them, it's very simple. You just have to do the work. You have to be out there. You have to knock on doors. You have to be consistent. You have to execute at a high level. And you have to empower people.
And we have value. We are experts, and we need to be valued, and we need to be supported. And that's what I'm going to stand on, and I'm going to always stand on. In spite of all these inequities, if they would support the people on the ground and work with them and strengthen those bonds in the community building, a lot of the stuff proactively would be fixed.
I don't really know how to go.
One of the things that I advocate for is connecting the dots between.
Okay. Wow, this is interesting. Computer trouble. For the BLC Field School, EJ Research was a community engaged project, but it often begins with a personal commitment, reflection, and commitment of time from each of the participants. Many of us begin with struggling as we struggle to even define the term environmental justice itself. When the term was initially used in the early part of this century, it referred to excessive instances of pollution and contamination in environments occupied by poor and marginalized people. That definition has expanded as we realized how problems ranging from pollution, job loss, lack of access to food, housing, transportation, racism, gender inequality, hate, violence, and an inability to access wealth, especially generational wealth, they're all interconnected. So what I've done is I've collected a series of definitions in the resource guide that should be available to you. But for the purpose of this panel, I will focus and reiterate Julian Aguiman's definition of environmental justice activism as, quote, a local, grassroots, or bottom-up community reaction to external threats to the health of the community, which have been shown to disproportionately affect people of color in low-income neighborhoods. Notice that the description and the definition here doesn't focus only on the ills as much as it does on people's resistance to it. And as you will hear from Tatum later, the wisdom and knowledge of those who resist everyday forms of injustice, that kind of human agency, can teach us much about collectively addressing and fighting this social evil. Social problems, as I said, are often interconnected and cannot be resolved through simple solutions. For instance, there is no one cause of poverty. Rather, it's a systemic problem, sometimes called a wicked problem. So, for instance, poverty is linked to education, nutrition is linked to poverty, and the economy is related to nutrition, and so on and so forth. So in other words, there are many dimensions to EJ, which all actually includes environmental, social and economic and other forms of kind of issues that are connected. EJ is also connected to climate and climate-induced disasters that disproportionately affect and impact marginalized population. It is related to democratic organizing and equal representation of voices that should be heard, that should be allowed to be heard. So in your resource guide, you'll find 3 documents produced by grassroots group that list principles of environmental justice, climate justice, and democratic organizing. Let us focus on just 2 principles from the document explaining the core EJ principles adopted by most scholars and practitioners today. It was a document that came only in 1991, where the National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit came together at the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. If you look at the first one, which is number 7, it demands the right for participation and voice of everyone, which is about procedures that happen in order to in order to deliver goods and resources. Oftentimes government procedures people should have equal access to it, and there should be a voice that they should have in that. The second one, environmental justice, affirms the need for urban and rural ecological policies to clean up and rebuild our cities and areas, make natural areas, honoring the cultural integrity of our communities, and provide fair access for all to the full range of resources is about distribution. And so oftentimes, environmental justice has 3 concepts that we have to remember. The first one is distributive, which is basically the goods and resources that we share should be equally available to everyone and should be distributed equally. Second one is procedural, which is basically how these decisions are made. And the third one, and that fact that everyone should have a voice in the decision making. But the third one, which is an interesting one, is about recognition. Who's valued and who's not. And for those people who are interested in following up a little more, the third one, recognition, draws from the capabilities theory developed by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. So let's take the example of fracking. And then if you look at the image at the bottom right, the distributive justice argument will say, if you're going to be doing fracking, who's at risk? How is the distribution or geographical distribution of fracking benefiting some people and others risking other people? The procedural one looks at, when you decide on these things, who are the stakeholders? Are they being heard? And the third one, which is recognition, literally looks at the values that we put in the decision-making practices, who we value, whose voices we have value. So I wanted to end my section by offering you 4 principles, which I think are important. First is do your homework, which is we should be careful to recognize that what is done in response to an ecological, social, and economic crisis indeed actually impacts and resolve some of these problems. So the Climate Justice Alliance have identified some solutions which they call are false solutions, which is, for instance, they're short-sighted. They look okay in the short term, but they end up destroying the earth and people over time. So for instance, technological cures and creative solutions which leave out human repercussions. For instance, carbon trading, clean coal, fracking, just prisons, which I feel is a contradiction of terms, just mining, only zero carbon thinking without thinking of the social aspects of intensive industrial productions. They say that if you just look at only these kind of answers, you lose the main issue here, which is about caring for people and the world around us. The second takeaway is that we should move from an extractive to a generative model of thinking. So an extractive economy is consumer-driven, based on exploitation of land, labor, resources. It's an economy where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer in a systemic and unjust way. It is one in which violence, militarism, control are seen as legitimate forms of power. A generative model begins by listening to people. It's bottom up. It's a system that is nurturing and ethical. It values people's skills and is based on principles of care for each other. And so a generative economy focuses on ecological and social well-being, cooperation, democratic traditions. It amplifies local voices, sustains global cooperation. Now, all this might seem very idealistic to many, but in reality, it is actually practiced by millions of people in communities across the world and North America. And in fact, we don't have to go too far to look for it. We have found some of these principles in actual work in the communities that we work with in Milwaukee. And we can go back to these issues later. The third issue is, in order to transition to a better world, think of EJ as ethical practice. So in the PDF, you'll find actually 5 principles of justice work. There are too many of them to talk about right here, but I want to touch on one, which is buen vivir, which means that we can live well together without living well at the expense of somebody else. Workers, community residents, women, indigenous people, migrants, immigrants, refugees, people around who also have a fundamental right to clean, healthy, equal air, water, land, food, education, and shelter. We must have relationships with each other and with the natural world of which we are part of. The rights of peoples and communities and nature must supersede the rights of individuals. And the other one, which is one of the best environmental justice ethical doctrine, is the one which was written by Pope Francis, which actually it's in the resource document too. And number 4 has to do with working to gain trust and work across the differences. And this is something that I'll let Camille Mays, our community partner, tell you about. Let her voice speak for this.
As a community organizer, what I like to see is people come in and see if their input is actually what the community really needs. We've been going to those spaces, doing activities, and the Regent and his students have participated in a lot of those and helped organize those. They created planters and benches so that they can be installed at the park. They're listening to what the people in the neighborhood are saying, and they're giving us the support that we need. Like, we couldn't afford to pay architects to draw up all of these plans, but they're doing it for us. So it's not only writing about it, but they all actually made impact.
One of the things that we're really interested for all the different constituencies is to explore how history and memory can be brought to bear from whatever institution or sector or career path you wind up in.
So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Tatum and Mallory to describe how we are part of an even larger EJ movement that encompasses communities and cultures across the world. I need to get up with it. There you go.
All right, thank you, Arijit. This is my slide. So I'm Mallory. I was a student intern with Arijit, I think in 2019, and I joined in the very first year that the BLC Field School started working with the Humanities Action Lab. I'm going to refer to them as HAL, just so I don't have to say so many syllables. And HAL is this really great network, an organization. They are located in Newark, New Jersey, at Rutgers University. The woman who was at the very end of that last video, she is sort of the lead on the project. But what HAL really is a big coalition of universities and community groups that work together to produce some sort of community curated public history project. So every 2 years or so, they adjust topics and switch to something new. And so the year that we joined in on the traveling exhibition called Climates of Inequality. And the photo on the left is a picture of what the exhibits ended up looking like. So we have 2 panels in one of those little bubbles. It took a lot of work to get those 2 panels, but it was really worth it and a great process. And so the whole point of this exhibit was, in blue is the outline, is that it provided multiple ways to learn about environmental issues affecting various communities, the historical roots of the issues, and then the strategies to transition from extractive environments to generative ones. And so like I said, we only had 2 panels. There were like 20 other partners in our coalition from across the nation, as well as we had some global partners. So there was lots of good feedback in the group. And our exhibit for Milwaukee in Sherman Park, we ended up titling Urban Blight as Environmental Injustice. And our project turned out to be so similar to lots of groups' stories, but it started off very different because a lot of groups were looking at stories and issues that had happened from natural disasters like a earthquake or a tornado. And we didn't really have anything like that in Milwaukee or in our research or our oral histories from the BLC Field School. What we discovered, what was happening was something that we ended up calling slow death, and that it was the urban blight in the neighborhoods was just very slowly killing the residents of the neighborhoods. So that's how we came to our title, Urban Blight as Environmental Injustice. And so it started off quite differently, but the more that we talked to the other partners in the coalition, we discovered that they also had a lot of the same issues that residents in our neighborhood were going through. And that last bullet point on the slide was sort of our thoughts that we put together as students, was that we started untangling this mess, but after working with the partners, we came to realize that the residents of the neighborhood had been working as residents of change for a long time, long before we got there. All right, you can go to the next slide to reach it. Okay. So this is just a little bit about how HAL works and their process. It's pretty amazing. So HAL worked with us. We were the local partners in this situation, and they provided to us resources about environmental justice, a curated work plan, design guidelines and design files, the actual physical exhibit, which was supposed to come to Milwaukee. It may still in the future. It was supposed to come last May, which didn't happen. They helped us provide public programs, a web platform. So not only do we have the BLC Field School websites and the MKE EJ website, but we also have one with Humanities Action Lab. They help support us go to the convening. So that's a picture on the right-hand side of myself, and then 2 of our partners, Reggie and Camille, and then Tiana Cooksey and Tommy Yang, I believe his last name is. He was actually in this meeting. I saw his name pop up. And that was us at the convening. They helped us come there and represent our 2 panels of our exhibit and say a little bit about our research. And so what we had to provide back in exchange was a regent needed to teach a course. And I was lucky enough to be the intern. And then we had a group of about 5 or 6 graduate students and also a crew of undergraduate students, and then our community partners. So another thing that we needed to have was we needed to collaborate with a local group. So we had Reggie Jackson, who I believe probably you met at your last talk, and then Camille Mays from the Peace Garden Project. We needed to curate a piece of the traveling exhibit. So those top 2 pictures were our final pieces. You can see it's a collection of images, maps, text, and then there's also a tablet there that had oral histories. And then there was a virtual goggle experience, which was really cool. We're actually going to show you the video at the end of this. And then the last piece was that we needed to host public dialogues, which ours got a little bit messed up, but maybe in like the coolest way possible, because we were supposed to host them when the video or when the exhibit came to visit us, which didn't happen. And so we had to transition to hosting sort of webinars online. And Tatum's going to talk a little bit more about them, but that was just to give you a highlight. So last thing was, we go back 1 second. I just want to point out the 4 pillars that HAL incorporates. So their 4 pillars are that they are community centered. So any work that we did, it needed to be focused on the community. They're also coalition oriented. So that is working with that wider network was really important. We couldn't just work in our own Milwaukee silo. Change oriented. So that's working towards change at the local level. And then accountability. So not only are we accountable to HAL for giving them that stuff, and they're accountable for us for supporting us, but mainly that we were accountable to our community partners. So I wanted to take it down to our local level because this was the best part of the project. We got to spend time in Sherman Park and with partners and meet people and build relationships. And so that picture on the left, we went out, it was like the coldest day of winter ever. And we went on a tour with Camille, who showed us all around the park, and lots of people invited us into their homes, and we melted snow all over their floors. And I've never felt more welcomed into a community ever. The middle picture is our group enjoying a great restaurant that's popped up in the Sherman Park neighborhood. And then that picture on the left is a project that we had at the end of the exhibit called a Jane's Walk that Camille gave, where you take residents and non-residents from Sherman Park and you show them all the great parts of your neighborhood and the not so great parts too. So that was really the teeny tiny local piece, and our exhibit broke down everything into sort of 4 buckets when we were thinking about the idea of slow death. And yeah, they're down in the right hand corner. And so we started thinking about, what do you need to survive, right? The bare minimum. Okay, will you go back one? You need food, you need shelter, and you need access. Regit, will you go back?
Mallory, we have to end also at 7:40, so you might want to give it to Tatum at some point.
Okay, let me just wrap up. All right, we're transitioning into Tatum, who is great. But just to wrap up, our 4 things we looked at, we're taking back our homes, our bodies, our streets, and our lands. All right, head over to Tatum, who's going to talk about our webinars.
Thanks, Mallory. So we only have to end at, we're only shooting for 7:40 just to give everybody enough time for questions. So I'll try and speed it up here a little bit, but obviously it is 7:40, so give me like 5 minutes. So I want to talk about resistance and agency within the community. So I'm just going to give some highlights about what the community does to resist environmental injustice. And everything that I'm going to discuss are projects and initiatives from the community. And there are many ways that community members resist injustices. The main avenue is through taking action, which is taking action through care. And so community members are agents of change in their neighborhoods, and they are aware of the injustices and the causes. And what they need from us and from institutions, volunteers, and government are the resources. So here are some examples of the care that they have in their community. A couple examples are community gardens. So Peace Garden Project MKE is headed by Camille Mays, who we have talked about a few times. And it's not your typical community garden when you think of growing produce for the community. This garden focuses on beauty and memorial through flowering plants. And if you want more information on Peace Garden MKE, there's a great Facebook page and it's up to date. Sorry, cat. And the next garden is Victory Gardens, which is actually located in the Harambe neighborhood. But that's more of a garden that you think of when you think of growing produce for the community. And that's kind of why I wanted to include it on this list of things. Another way that the community cares for their neighborhood is by activating the porch. And this is something we explored in our exhibit or our project over the summer. The idea might seem simple, but in reality, engaging the porch brings life to the street. So when the porch is beautified and when neighbors are sitting on it, it then becomes a stimulated space. And it becomes a space where neighbors can sit on it and they can watch over the street and they can connect with each other, people walking by or other neighbors sitting on the porch. It becomes an active area for the neighborhood and for the block. And so simple acts of care can go a long way. And this leads us into connecting with neighbors. When community members connect with neighbors, it becomes a chain reaction of connection. Going for a walk around the block, it not only connects you with the people in the space, but it also is a way to visualize what's happening in your neighborhood. So these are everyday examples of community care that might be overlooked. And this picture is of a Sherman Park community member maintaining Skylar's Park. You can go to the next slide, Arijit. Do you want to play us the video, Arijit? It's about 2 minutes. Arijit, you might, I'm not getting any sound.
Map.
What?
The area that Blacks could live in, and also preventing them from living the same standard that whites had. Despite some of the difficulties, Blacks had the largest per capita Black business ownership rate of any city. But by the year 2000, both of those would shift in the opposite direction.
Manufacturing buildings employed a lot of the core community in Milwaukee. And so when those factories left, a lot of people left the neighborhoods, or the neighborhoods became very poverty stricken.
What just happened? Okay, well, sorry guys. I'm just gonna go to the last slide then, Tatum. Technical difficulties, people. Even though we live in a technically fantastic
Okay.
world.
It wouldn't be a webinar without them.
Yep, I know. Are we in the right place?
Yep. So I just want to talk about what we learned from the community. We learned to listen, stay, and meet the community where they are. And this list of items were things that were told to us by community members. As an outside organization or a person, when you want to enter a community, of course, the first thing you do is ask, but the next thing that you have to do is listen. You'll likely come to the community with an idea of your own, but you need to listen to the community about what it is that they need and want. The community already knows the injustices of their neighborhood. And as outside institutions, if we want to help, then we need to listen. And the next thing we need to do is stay. Many community members have expressed to us that they enjoy working with the field school because Arijit and his students have stayed for many years. It doesn't help the community if you aid in one project and then leave. So trust and change take years, so plan to stick around. And finally, meet the community where they are. This is on par with listening, but coming into the community with a huge idea might not be what's best for them in that moment. There's more that needs to be done than just aiding a community financially. There's also an emotional and a physical element to all of this. So come to the community without judgment and ready to stay and listen. And that's one thing that happened with us over the summer. We delivered food and we had a learning curve with delivering the food. There were family sizes we did take into consideration, food allergies, food prep. These are things that we should have discussed with the community before we decided to deliver food. You can go to the next slide, Arijit. And this is our exhibit from the summer. So the 2020 exhibit, Mallory had discussed climates of inequality. We were going to have an exhibit come over the summertime, but that could not happen. So we titled our summer project, Taking Back Our Worlds. And what we did is we did a virtual and delivery method. In the month of August of 2020, we delivered packages of food and zines to community members to help with the aid of community leaders. And we held weekly webinars discussing that week's topic of environmental justice. So we had an overview, and then we talked about housing justice, food justice, and then taking action through care. And we initially planned for the in-person exhibition. We did the COVID-19 pivot, which included webinars, zines, food. And if you don't know what a zine is like a mini magazine. And we wanted to have, our hope was that a physical, here's a picture of the front of a zine. The hope was that a physical zine getting delivered, a physical element would be a benefit. They could trade, they could share them with other people in the community, but also by August 2020, many people were burnt out virtually. So we wanted to bring another element to this. And the zines included histories, stories of community leaders, community food, community restaurant, stories of environmental justice, things that people in the community likely already knew. But it was a nice way to have it physical and tangible. If you go to our website, mkejlab.weebly.com, you can see all of our zines and our webinars that we did in August. And these pictures are just our food packing and delivery process. And then that's it for me.
I think I'm going to just quickly go through this. People asked us what they can do. You can join our field school this summer. More details will be available with Sue involved. Or you can contribute and go and work with some of our partners. Again, these details are in the resource guide that we produced. Does anyone want to chime in? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a slide just if you're wondering how can you help community, of course, volunteering for the organizations that Arija just said. Donating mutual aid is a really good thing. So here's an image of Milwaukee Community Care and Mutual Aid. It's their Facebook page. Mutual aid is great because you know that if you're donating to a mutual aid fund, it's likely going directly to the person who needs it. And if you're ever wondering what mutual aid is local to you, here's a Milwaukee example, but a lot of cities have them. So if you're from another city, feel free to look up. I'm sure if you were to just Google your city mutual aid, something will come up. And what happens is these mutual aid funds, they promote people's Cash Apps, Venmos, PayPal. So you know that the money you donate goes directly to people. So this is a really good way to help our city. If you contact the other person or the city officials, you can try and push for resources, encourage the city to allocate their budget to more neighborhood services. That would be helpful. But simply asking questions and listening and being consistent if you're choosing to help.
I'm going to post a couple of links in the chat. One is to sign up for Sherry Fuqua's email list, which she is one of our main partners, been with us for a long time and does a lot of work in these small parks around Sherman Park. And the next two lists will be some PayPal links where you can support our partners financially if you choose to do so. So look for that in the chat. I'll be posting it in a second or two.
I think that with that, we're all set for questions and answers. And I'm sorry we went on too long, but hey, you were not expecting anything less, right?
That's right. Thank you so much for your presentation. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat, and we'll also look for hands up if you want to verbalize your question. And Dr. Sen or the panelists, there is a question. I don't know if you can see it, but I'll read it so everyone can see it. If you could address the discrepancy of funding for transit versus automobiles, for example, who benefits from the I-94 expansion and who bears most of the environmental costs?
I'll give it a shot. So there is a lot of literature on this issue of transit development that's actually pretty big in our discussion. So in our EJ Lab website, there is a section called Transit Transit Justice. And there was a student who actually did a series of research on talking to local activists, lawyers, about this whole idea of the freeway expansion. And those of you who have heard Reggie talk about the number of people who actually use the freeway includes people moving out of Milwaukee to work in the suburbs and people moving into Milwaukee, and they're extremely racially distributed. And so the freeway expansion has been not only because of the kind of because of who is gaining and who's losing from it, but also the freeway also destroys communities along which it passes by because of pollution and so on. And we have a long history of freeways being used for urban renewal and urban development, which pretty much impacted marginalized communities more than other communities, certainly not the communities where people are beginning from or going towards. Others can chime in if you want.
There's a wonderful interview with one of our community resident participants, a lawyer named Roy Evans, who lives on Grant Boulevard. And he grew up in the Bronzeville area. And he says, whenever he speaks with somebody, he always asks when they got to Milwaukee, did they know Milwaukee before the freeway or after the freeway? Because it completely changed his world. He saw a close-knit and thriving African-American neighborhood when he was growing up, and he saw that slip away mostly through the construction of the freeways. And like I mentioned before, that construction of the freeways was largely destructive for neighborhoods of color because they were seen as less valuable places by the city. Anyone else want to chime in?
Mallory has a good link here, which is the one which I was talking about.
Analyst, I've got a question. I'm curious about, you mentioned how you were seemed to be welcomed by local residents. I'm curious if you felt any resistance from some folks, and if you were able to overcome that resistance or lack of openness, and if so, how you were able to do that? Just through your presence.
Yeah, I can give it a shot. So I'm not from this country to begin with. I'm an American, but I have an accent. So it's hard for me to walk into a neighborhood and suddenly say, hey, listen, I want to be a friend. It doesn't happen that way. So I tell my students and my colleagues that building trust is part of that EJ work. It's not not something outside. It took me 4 years just to be accepted as part of the community. And the way I did it is I just had to show up. I had to do the work. We have to recognize that many communities in the Milwaukee area have seen academics and universities and good, well-intentioned people come in, do stuff, and then go away. And they've seen that as extractive, take information or whatever, and just go away and never see them again. So part of our project, and this is from the image that Chelsea showed, that our field school got longer and longer in a place, and that is the only way I feel that we generated acceptance. We got acceptance from the people in the neighborhood. Chelsea, you want to add, or others? Mallory, Tatum.
Maybe I'll bring it back to what Tatum was mentioning with the food bags. This summer, we decided, because we couldn't hold an in-person exhibit on environmental justice, we decided we'd take that exhibit, compact it into these mini handmade magazines or zines, and deliver that to people with this fresh, locally grown produce from Alice's garden and other urban gardens. And we didn't realize, in our minds, we had come up with this brilliant pivot, taking our exhibit and pairing it with this food. But we didn't realize that there are many organizations from Marquette to Goodwill that do this kind of food bag giveaway. And sometimes the food in those bags is something like macaroni and cheese or something less nutritious. In our bags, it was nutritious, but in the first week, we made the very embarrassing mistake of just including a couple of bunches of herbs and maybe 1 or 2 vegetables, which is hardly enough. And I think we really disappointed some people, and they were very vocal about it, that we underestimated them, we didn't talk to them. And it took a few phone conversations. It also took us improving the contents of those bags for the next week and improving even more the week after that. So I'll answer it by saying we have an open dialogue, we check in with people, but we can always do more.
And one of the methods that we have operated on is called collaborative ethnography, which is basically, you just don't go there and do projects and come back. You take your responses back to them. You have a continuous evolving communication and cooperation and conversation. So the zines that Tatum was talking about were produced out of 4 years of interaction with the community members. These were issues that they had told us were important. So we kind of distill them and produce the zine, send it back to them and have more conversations around it. So this kind of iterative nature was, I think, important. And the big one was that none of us really, we went knowing that we were going to make mistakes. And we made mistakes. And we said sorry, and we stayed. So I think that we had to just be there.
Professor, we have a couple more questions from our audience. Number one, could you discuss how climate change is impacting communities of color versus white communities?
Yeah, I want to actually say that from the point of view of Milwaukee. So, when we started working with Hal, there were people who were talking about, tornadoes and, mudslides and cancer alleys, huge disasters out of pollution or climate change. We thought first that, well, Milwaukee doesn't have that. And then till one of my students told me, hey, you know what? Cold weather and enhanced winters is a form of climate change that's happening. So for instance, in Milwaukee, you might not see any homeless people in some of the neighborhoods. You actually have started seeing homeless people, but at that time, 2 or 3 years ago, there were fewer. And the reason was a lot of homeless people are people who are transitory, moving from one place to another, move between people's living rooms. So some of the living rooms serve as a place for people to move from one place to another. But those people who don't have access to those who are homeless, who are out on the streets or living in empty houses, feel the punch of winter way more than any of us do. And so you find a lot of times burnt out houses, and it's not always arson. It is sometimes homeless people trying to heat themselves up in an empty house which they've found. So that itself, housing injustice in relation to cold, pretty much brings forth the complete disaster that happens to people who are poor, people of color. And because Milwaukee is so segregated, poverty and race are kind of coincidental in a geographic area. Yeah.
You see Robert Mullins brought up the parallel between the history with the freeways. Does it sound familiar to COVID-19 and the minority communities not having access to the vaccination, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, this continues. So COVID-19 was a big problem. However, one good thing is the African-American community in Milwaukee became extremely aware. This is where mutual aid and self-help comes in. And these are where we have found instances of caring that allows people to be resilient. So in a recent article, Reggie Jackson pointed out how in the beginning, the COVID infection rate in Black communities in the Milwaukee area was very high, but then it actually reduced a little bit because there was mutual aid. There was a lot of help within the community helping each other. But yes, the vaccine availability is still a problem, as much a problem as vaccine resistance, considering the fact that many of the community members still remember how vaccines and medical experiments were used on people of color in the past. Chelsea,
yeah, to add to that, to link the freeways and also kind of the emptying out of the city, a lot of healthcare institutions, hospitals, clinics, especially specialized clinics, have left the city, have moved to the suburbs. And that creates not only a lack of resources, but also the few resources that remain are incredibly crowded and overworked, where our essential workers, especially our healthcare workers, are just overloaded. And that was even before the pandemic. So I think the pandemic has certainly brought to light some of those issues as well.
And actually, if you look at our essential workers, if you look at the healthcare workers, the frontline workers, you begin to see a large number of them actually come from the North Side neighborhoods. So that's another really powerful way COVID has impacted communities.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sen and Tatum and Mallory and Chelsea for your time. We've come to our ending time tonight. I really appreciate you helping us understand some of the challenges that we face. I think someone used the phrase a wicked problem or wicked challenge that we have, and this helps us have a better understanding of that and gives us some ideas on how we as individuals can help and assist, again, in a way that's consistent with the teachings of Jesus. So thank you very much for your time and your willingness to share with us your experiences. I want to thank the attendees. And now I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Janet for a closing prayer.
And I'll just add my thanks as well to all of you for being here, and especially to you leaders. This has been very eye-opening for me, and I'm sure for many of us. So I'll just close with a word of thanks to God for this time we've spent together. But dear God, we do thank you for this opportunity that we've had tonight to learn more about important issues that affect the communities near us. Though we've just scratched the surface, we have learned new terms and new ideas, and have learned that it really all comes down to caring for each other and for the earth, our common home. I thank you for those who are working every day to make the communities around Milwaukee and in other parts of the country better places to live. I thank you for those who are listening to the stories and listening to the needs and finding ways through volunteering and donating and mutual aid to really seek justice for all people. I pray that as we go back to our churches, we'll be able to share some of what we've learned and be able to inspire others to come to a commitment to respect and seek justice for all people. And as we continue our journey in all ways, help us to embody the values of our faith, that we may be inspired and have our hearts and minds open, and also that you will give us patience for the long haul, for we know this is not easy work and it's not work that will be done overnight. May this be a good beginning for all of us so that we can promote really good life with each other and with all the natural world. And I ask these things on all our behalf in Jesus' name. Amen.